Hello and welcome. Russia's manpower troubles are coming back, but this is not the end of the story. This and more in this situation report. Bloomberg published that Putin himself has permitted the arrest of the Wall Street Journal correspondent Evan Gershkovich. It's the first arrest in Russia of a US journalist since the Cold War, and it seems likely that this is some kind of political measure to allow for an exchange of prisoners later in that later. The Kremlin the Kremlin spokesperson Peskov has said, though, this was not an order from the political sphere because Russia's criminal system works independently. Yeah. The FSB said they have identified the murder, the persons involved in the murder of Maxim Fomin, known as Vladlen Tatarsky. Supposedly, the SBU agents, that's Ukrainian intelligence, Daria Trepova and Yuri Denisov, killed him together with the Navalny intimates Leonid Volkov and Ivan Shadanov. They observed their victim and then made sure he's getting killed later. This obviously, connecting this to Navalny, will raises the expectation that it will be used to allow for a longer prison sentence for Navalny. On the Eastern Front in Ukraine, we have reports about a Ukrainian counterattack, and even according to Russian sources, it was partially successful here at Kryvoshivka. They pushed forward somewhere here and reached that road. So yeah, they do counterattacks and they achieved something, but it's probably nothing that changes the overall outcome. Other than that, we have reports of Russian attacks in the usual places. So the fighting is more or less concentrating around Krymina now. Makivka attacks in Makivka, Neveske in the direction of Terny, Yampulivka and Torske. There's also fighting at Krymina, south of it, southwest of it, especially in the Serebryanska forest. And Brigadier General Oleksiy Romov, the deputy chief of the main operational directorate of the Ukrainian General Staff, was saying the Russians are currently sending motorized rifle units, BARS, that's the reserve forces, volunteer reserve forces of the Russian armed forces, as well as special forces and recon elements to Krymina. So the Russians want to achieve a success here and try to achieve it fairly soon. South of the Seversky Donetsk, we have reports about attacks at Bilohorivka, somewhere south of it. The Russians have achieved some successes. They gained some territory. There's also reports of fighting close to Spirne. No change in control here, and attacks in the direction of Romove and Bodanivka also doesn't seem to have changed anything in this regard. In Bakhmut itself, there are further Russian successes, and basically every day we have reports and geolocalizations of the Russian being one further block down the road, etc. So I can't tell you where the front line is currently developing because it's moving all the time, but it's moving really slowly. But it's moving in favor of the Russians, that much is sure. So far, though, the lines of communication, at least how they were a week ago, have not changed. That they aren't really good lines of communication is on a different page, but in this regard, at least those fighters here are still getting supplied. The VDV was involved here in the attacks, at least that's the report, and supposedly now the VDV is supporting Wagner units by covering their flanks by giving suppressive fire, but the majority of the attacks still seem to be by Wagner forces. Brigadier Oleksiy Romov again said the Russians brought reinforcements from Avdiivka to Bakhmut. So after we had it 2 weeks ago that Bakhmut is... units from Bakhmut are being moved to Avdiivka. Now the Ukrainians say the opposite again. And Romov also said the Russians have lost 4,000 men since the 30th of March in Bakhmut alone. So within 15 days, supposedly, or 14 days, supposedly 4,000 personnel was lost. Obviously, we can't say here whether that actually supposedly means they were killed or whether they were just killed and wounded, which makes a massive difference. But as we've seen in the past, the numbers the Ukrainians give us are, let's put it mildly, very optimistic when it comes to Russian losses. We've seen that in the recent leaks where the Americans have shown to roughly see the actual losses by the Russians at 1/3 of what the Ukrainians were reporting. At Avdiivka, we have reports about further Russian attacks, and they actually had some success here at Novobakhmutivka in the direction of Novokalinove. Supposedly, they crossed the N20 here, or they did cross the N20. They did move in the direction of Novokalinove. Further south, we have reports about attacks at the usual places: Krasnohorivka, Vesele, Opytne, Sivierne, Pervomayske, and Nevelske. I cannot confirm any successes in this regard. And we have fighting heavy fighting is supposedly happening right now in Marinka. Also attacks in the direction of Pobieda and Novo-Mikhailivka. In the direction of Pobieda, it's likely that the Russians gained some ground here. But again, I cannot fully confirm to which degree. It seems that we can always see those lines here. That those are usually where the defensive positions are. So the Russians have probably managed to reach the next wooded line, but that was more or less it. On the southern front, the Russians are still reporting reconnaissance attacks or reconnaissance enforced by the Ukrainians here at the Zaporizhzhia front. And Russia has now a defensive line consisting out of 3 different lines behind each other over a width of 120 kilometers. That's what the British Ministry of Defense is reporting. In front, they have the regular positions at the front line, but behind that there are 2 more zones that are vastly superior and vastly more sophisticated when it comes to their defensive capabilities. Each zone is roughly 10 to 20 kilometers behind the previous zone, so roughly 50 kilometers in depth. If we add this up to 50 kilometers in depth is the defensive line here. The British Ministry of Defense is saying those positions have the potential to be formidable obstacles for a Ukrainian attack, but it will obviously completely dependent on the personnel that is manning those units, on their support, heavy weapons, ammunition, all those other things, and whom they are facing. But in general, the positions themselves are being taken more or less serious, even though there are some criticism in the past that the positions were drawn on a line on the map, disregarding necessities on the ground and things like that are being reported. But still, regardless of that, the British Ministry of Defense thinks they're going to be formidable of defensive roadblocks. There are reports from Inehordar of the Zaporizhzhia power plant. According to that, the Russians are still mining areas around the power plant, but only around, not in it. And the International Atomic Energy Organization has reported that 2 of those mines recently exploded. There's also just 1 electric line to the power plant, which needs electricity to perform the active cooling of the nuclear reactors. So there's only 1 line to do that. And at the same time, the reservoir, the Kakhovka reservoir, is now 2 meters below the line that is necessary for cooling, which doesn't cause an immediate problem, as this is a cooling pond which was used to pump water in to allow for the cooling of the power plant. So there's still water in here, but they apparently, that should mean that they can't, at least not easily, replenish that water. Obviously, pumps can be extended, pumping lines can be set, but as of now, at least when it comes to the installed pumps, the water is no longer high enough, the water line, to allow for additional cooling water to be pumped in. The International Atomic Energy Organization was also saying 1/3 of the workers of the power plant have left, and the rest has either signed with Rosenergoatom, which is the Russian atomic energy organization, or they are still continuing to work for the Ukrainian Energoatom, so for the Ukrainian atomic energy organization. Generally, we have reports that Russia is now using roughly 20 gliding bombs daily, especially in the Donbass. That supposedly has significant effect, and Ukraine is saying they don't have any effective measures against that. I'm still researching the topic, but it seems that the Russians managed to add a kind of like a JDAM kit by adding a kit with wings to regular dumb bombs, to iron bombs. And that system is obviously in mass production now. At least that's what the Ukrainians tell us. And it has to be fairly accurate and fairly well done. Otherwise, the Ukrainians wouldn't voice their complaints. And otherwise, they wouldn't talk about up to 20 uses of this system daily. They are usually being dropped by Sukhoi 34 and Sukhoi 35. The Washington Post was saying the Russians had heavy losses on their special units. The 346 Spetsnaz brigade, as an example, is down from 900 now to at 125 men of strength. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise after over a year of usage, and the Russians haven't rotated their units much, so they mostly stayed along the front line. And to be also perfectly honest, I don't think it's fundamentally different for the Ukrainian side. They also suffered heavy losses, so that the Russian special forces are down to, what is it, 20% of their strength, and the Ukrainians are still at 80% seems fairly unlikely. The Ukrainians have suffered significant losses as well. Partisan activity is reported this time, though, in a pro-Russian way, if you want it this way. The Russians claimed they arrested 2 members of the Noman Chelebitschichan, more or less, volunteer group. That was founded 2016 by Crimean Tatars on the Crimean Peninsula, and they said they arrested 2 of them in Sevastopol, 2 members. Also in Mariupol, the Russians are reporting that they arrested 2 partisans that planned a bomb attack on a police chief. When it comes to the mobilization, Brigadier General Alexei Romov, we already mentioned him, is saying the crypto mobilization is very little, has a low rate of being effective, as the Russians understand that the loss rate is fairly high. So volunteering when you expect to go into a meat grinder is not the most likely. At the same time, Russia is seemingly creating new PMCs to address this, but the Ukrainians are saying it'll take a long time until those will be close to being as effective as Wagner, which obviously is not just didn't start with a big man pool, but also with an experienced pool of personnel, which other PMCs don't have. But at the same time, Romov is saying it should not be underestimated what Russia has as a potential to generate forces in the future, which is obviously something we need to address the whole time when we talk about weaknesses from the Russian side. Russia still has more than 3 times the population of the Ukrainian side, and it still has a significant stock of military equipment and weapons. A lot of it might not be usable, a lot of it might be obsolete, but in general, they do have stocks, whereas Ukrainian side basically has nothing left, and in the West, it's kind of drying out as well. The law about the creation of a digital database for the mobilization of Russian forces, of Russian people, is not active yet. Putin still has to sign it, and right now there's discussion when it's even going to become active, because panic was spreading in Russia as people thought it's going to be in effect right away, and this will allow for a second wave of mobilization. There were reports that ticket prices for planes are going up again, so people are starting to flee Russia again, but now the Russians are saying, no, that's not even close, and there are some talks about late, maybe for the fall conscription in 2023, and supposedly Putin said, I want this to be ready for 2024. So an immediate mobilization wave seems fairly unlikely in this context. There's also a report that 100 mobilized soldiers have disappeared after saying no to being hired by Wagner. Some of them signed up and gave reports about this, but the situation as of now isn't really fully confirmed, fully cleared out yet. There were some reports, you might have read it as well already, so I cannot really tell you much more insight in this, but supposedly Wagner was trying to force Russian mobilized personnel at gunpoint to sign with them, and those who did not sign were led away while being unarmed by armed Wagner guards, and since for a week or longer than a week, nobody has heard of them ever again. And we have a Telegram video here that's showing Ukrainian children being trained by Wagner, supposedly to fight Ukrainian soldiers in this regard. We see this here also here. You see the symbols on this. The Maria Lvova-Belova, the Russian commissar for children's rights, is saying Russia is the children that were vacationing in Russia have mostly returned to their family, except for those that cannot be sent home because of front movements at the front. She is being wanted by the ICC, by the International Criminal Court, for the deportation of children. Maybe that arrest warrant is actually having an effect here, that that she claims to send them home. But at the same time, the Russian Resistance Center is saying 100,000 children have been deported to Russia, mostly under the pretense of sending them to rehabilitation. The children are being medically examined, and a big part of them is then sent to Russia, supposedly for being treated. And reports from Russia, from the occupied areas of Ukraine, are that in several of them, the planned May 9th parades are being cancelled for security reasons. And when it comes to international support, we have something interesting here from the Chinese foreign minister. He says they won't sell weapons to Ukraine and to Russia, and that China will regulate dual-use material. Obviously, the Chinese can promise a lot in the public area, but it shows at the same time how close tight their so-called alliance is that is usually being talked about. China's alliance partner is China most for in front of everything. So aiding Russia in the conflict in a minor outskirt, probably from the Chinese view, it does not make sense if the repercussions are so big that the small gain for Russia justifies the risk for China. So the likelihood of China supplying Russia with weapons on a big scale seems fairly unlikely as of now. Obviously, small amounts of ammo, small spare parts and things like that can always be traded across the border, and we should expect that to happen. But that the Chinese are starting their factories and opening their depots to allow Russia to win this war seems highly unlikely. International support is coming for Ukraine, though. The first Leopard 1 A5s are ready are combat ready. The training is supposedly beginning very soon for the Ukrainian soldiers. So in roughly 2 to 3 months, they should be combat ready inside of Ukraine. There's a video circulating here that supposedly is fresh. I couldn't confirm it, but supposedly it shows Italian M109 self-propelled howitzers being shipped to Ukraine. At least that's the expectation. As Italy has the Panzerhaubitze 2000, it doesn't need those M109s anymore, and the new government of Italy has been very supportive of the Ukrainian side in this war, so it seems kind of likely at the same time. Germany also gave the permission to export its MiG-29s that Germany inherited from the socialist part of the country in the unification and then handed over to Poland. And German government has now given Poland the permission to give those MiG-29 fighter jets to Ukraine. What we have here is Canada confirming that the 8 promised Leopard 2 A4s are now have been delivered, and we have a report here according to which Ukrainian forces have received Sea King helicopters from the British. The Sea King is a very old design, a fairly old design, mostly a naval helicopter, so with torpedoes and depth charges used for search and rescue and for transport missions. So we shouldn't really expect it to see on the front line in some combat missions, but the Ukrainians have surprised us a couple of times in the past. So apparently now they received 2 Sea King helicopters from Great Britain. We have an interesting video here showing how difficult it is for the Russians to shoot them down. Those are Mi-8 helicopters flying below the treetops, basically. Highly risky flying, takes a lot of skill to successfully do this, but at the same time makes interception obviously fairly difficult. What we have here now is a confirmation supposedly from Ukraine. I cannot confirm it, but as you can see here at the fume extractor, this is a T-55, clearly a T-55 now being used inside of Ukraine, at least according to what we find. So the first T-55s have now appeared as well. Here we have an interesting picture that supposedly these are nets being used against loitering munition. In the past, there have been reports that the Russians are now using their Lancet loitering munitions to hit Ukrainian artillery right after it fires. So instead of doing regular counter battery fire, which takes a few minutes, they use Lancet drones, which is much faster and already leading to losses. This would be the attempt to prevent this by parking the howitzers in there. Whether it works or not, I'm not completely sure. But if this net actually either stops them and letting them then fall to the ground, or if it prematurely starts the detonation, the distance to the howitzer should be big enough that the damage at least should be repairable, that it shouldn't lead to complete destruction. What we have here is an interesting video. We see said like, how can the Russians abandon their tanks and completely undamaged? You see a BMP-3 and a Nona should be a mortar, if I'm not completely wrong. Yeah. But whatever it is, this is one thing where we need to have some caution. Just because the tank looks undamaged from the outside doesn't mean the inside isn't destroyed. When I was in the army, we received training how to destroy our military equipment. And of course, among that was blowing it up, but it also said which parts of the truck, for instance, to destroy just by shooting into it, by using a spade or something to destroy the electronics. This could very well have been done inside of the tanks and us not seeing it inside of the IFV here without us seeing it. So this is far from a proof that the Russians actually have left them just behind for the Ukrainians to use. And this here is very interesting. Now this is showing a T90M, and supposedly this must be contact one. And it actually looks like it. Now, really interesting when you see it here. And it's actually free swinging. Don't ask me how effective this is. Obviously, explosions go the path of least resistance. And if they're free floating, the path of least resistance should be closer to the tank. On the other hand, if that leads to the detonation further away from the hull, it's probably useful. But a very interesting concept that I haven't seen so far in this war or at all whatsoever. This was it from me for now. If you like the content I do, please hit the like button and leave a comment for the algorithm. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And this channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting the channel. That was it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.